Hello. How many of you set New Year's resolutions this year? It's almost the end of January. How many of you have succeeded in keeping your resolution so far? Or have you faltered? These are some questions that I would like to ask you before I delve into the topic of Lewin's model of change. Because what is a New Year's resolution? It's an attempt to change yourself, right? How many of you have tried to bring about any change in yourself? Forget the New Year's resolution. I'm sure all of you have had, right? Did you succeed in bringing about that change that you wanted to in your life? Or did you fail? Have you reflected on why you failed? Or why you succeeded when you did? Today's lecture is going to provide you some insights about this process of change. Why it succeeds when it succeeds, why it fails when it fails. What can you do to increase the probability of you succeeding in your change attempt? So, these are some of the insights that you will be gaining today. Going back to the New Year's resolution example that I started with, do you know that the statistics vary, but more than 90%, 92, 95% of the people who make New Year's resolutions, they fail to achieve them. That's a huge rate of failure. You can imagine that, right? 80% of the people who attempt to change themselves through New Year's resolutions, they fail just within a few weeks of their attempt. And here's an even more funny statistic. On an average, people make the same resolution 10 years in a row. So, because they are failing each time, they have to repeat their resolution again the next year. So, on an average, people repeat the same resolution over and over again for 10 years. That's the kind of dismal statistic that we have when it comes to the probability of you succeeding in your change attempt. My purpose here is not to make you pessimistic about change, because I'm sure many of you are already pessimistic about it. And even if you did or did not know anything about these statistics that I shared with you, many of you may have tried to form New Year's resolutions in the past, and you may have failed, not once, twice, but few times. So you may have decided that, hey, there's no sense in making these New Year's resolutions. I'm going to fail anyway, so why even try, right? So it's a case of not just giving up. Rather, it's a process of attempting change, being mindful of the different factors that contribute to the probability of it succeeding, and also being mindful of the factors that contribute to the probability of it failing. And if you can maximize the factors that contribute to the success of change and minimize the factors, the contribution of those factors that lead to the failure of change attempt, then you will be more likely to succeed in your life. So that's what I'm trying to drive home through this lecture. So the examples that I shared with you so far, they are examples of personal change, right? you as a person is trying to bring about some change in your life, whatever that change is. Exercising daily for an hour a day, or let's say you have some bad habit like drinking alcohol, so quitting alcohol and so on and so forth. These are changes that you are really motivated to bring about in yourself, and yet you fail, right? So the first lesson is motivation is not enough to bring about change. But now let's think about you trying to make a change attempt as a leader. Let's say you're trying to bring about some change in your family, in your kids, or if you are in some managerial position in your department, amongst your subordinates. Let's say you're trying to bring about some new system into place where people's behavior have to change in order for the new system to work. Imagine how much more difficult those change attempts will be. Let's say you are the CEO of an organization. You are trying to bring about change in the entire organization. Or you are the president of a country. You are trying to bring about some major change in the nation. People tend to have the illusion that these things will be easy, but you can imagine much more complex, much more difficult. When n equals 1, when the sample size is 1, just you trying to change yourself, you are failing. And you are even motivated to change. Still you are failing. Imagine when the n size grows from 1 to 5 to 10 to 50, 100, thousands, millions. It's going to be much more difficult to change. Because it's much more complex. And many of those people may not be motivated to change. You are motivated to bring about the change, but they may not be even motivated. So when change is so difficult, when somebody is motivated, you can imagine how much more difficult change will be when people are not motivated. So just because you decide one day to change something doesn't mean that change is going to happen. Change is a complex process. And it is exceptionally complex when it comes to big radical changes in organizations, in large groups, for that matter, even in small groups. So I hope this set the stage for the Lewin's change model. Now, I'm sure you have already read the couple of articles that I shared on Lewin's change model. Some of you may have also seen some YouTube videos on the topic. So Lewin's change model is very simple, right? It just has 3 stages: unfreeze, change, and refreeze. In unfreeze stage, you analyze the current state of the system, create a need for change so that people do not resist your attempt to change. Then you do the actual change, right? Make them change their behavior or attitude, whatever. So you implement the change process. That's the second stage. And finally, you refreeze the change. In other words, you consolidate the change so that the change that you initiated stays and people don't revert back to their old ways. So that's essentially what Lewin's model of change is. It's very simple. In fact, it seems overly simple, oversimplistic, which then makes us think that it's not very helpful. That's, of course, far from truth, because if we dive deeper into the model, we will understand that this model gives us some tremendous insights about the change process. And if we do take into consideration those factors, then we will be much more likely to succeed in our change attempts. Many people think that, this Lewin's change model, it is outdated. It was proposed way back in the 40s, 50s, right? So long ago. The world has changed so much since then, right? So this is an outdated model. In today's day, every day change is happening, So when we talk about refreezing, how can we refreeze something when we are expected to change every day. The world is changing so fast, so it is outdated. It doesn't work anymore. That's the kind of impression that many people have about Lewin's model, which of course is far, far from truth. So we need to dive deeper into Lewin's change model in order to understand and appreciate the insights, the wisdom that exists in that model. Now, before I do that, before I make a deeper dive into Lewin's change model, let's briefly talk about Lewin. So, Kurt Lewin, he is considered the intellectual father of organizational change. So, that's the kind of impact he has had on the field. Even though his works are from the 50s, 40s, 50s, he continues to have a strong impact in the field. And even though newer models of change have been proposed over the years, most of those models do build up on Lewin's model. So it does not necessarily negate the ideas, the evidence that was shared by Lewin, but rather they built upon it. Now, right now, of course, Lewin is most famously known for his contribution to the change model. But when he was alive, he was more renowned as a child psychologist. Of course, also as the creator of the field theory. And he did work on varied topics. He made some tremendous amount of research contribution as a child psychologist, did some great work on child-parent relationships, on conflict. Conflict is an area where he made some great contribution. Conflict in family, conflict in marriages, conflict in groups, conflict in organizations. In fact, the change model that he did propose was inspired from his research on conflict, how to manage conflict. He also made some great contributions to the field of group dynamics. What are the different factors that come into play when people work in groups? How can groups be more effective, and so on and so forth. He made great contribution also on the individual level performance, individual level motivation. And last but not the least, he made some exceptionally great contributions on discriminatory attitudes, on prejudice. That was something that he was really motivated to work on. And the change model that he proposed also is directly linked to his research on discrimination and prejudice. So how do you bring about those kinds of changes in an organization or in people? How do you eliminate their discriminatory attitudes? How do you change those attitudes which are not functioning well for the people or for themselves? And the reason he was so inspired to work on such kind of research is because he was a Jew, a German Jew. And he was a professor in one of the universities in Germany. But he had to leave Germany, had to come to US, take refugee status here because of the Nazi power taking over Germany and the huge amount of anti-Semitism that existed then. So he was really inspired to understand and do research on topics about how to bring about change in people. In context of Germany and the Nazi culture, for instance, he talks about it's not just about making some policy level changes. How do you overcome the Nazi culture that is deeply embedded amongst the youth of the people of Germany then, right? Those are the kind of questions that he was interested in. So anyway, I thought it was important that you understood a little bit of the kind of person that Lewin was, because that gives us some deeper appreciation of the model that he proposed. So now, delving deeper into the model, we said that it has three main stages: unfreeze, change, and refreeze, right? So if I am trying to, let's say this is a metal object, right? It's a stand for my iPad. Let's say I don't have any use for it. I have sold my iPad and I don't have any use for it. This metal is useless for me. So I would rather wish that this was a tumbler from which I could drink my coffee instead of this stand. So how do I change this metal stand into a metal tumbler that I can use to drink water, coffee, whatever? I cannot just carve this into a tumbler, right? What I have to do is I have to melt it. So this is in a frozen condition right now, right? No, I have to melt it, and then have the cast for making it into a tumbler, and then they refreeze it, or what should I say? So then it gets solidified as a tumbler, right? So you have to unfreeze it by melting it, and then put it into a what is it called? Into the shape of a tumbler that has that kind of framework, and then cool it down so that it freezes into the shape of a tumbler. Then I can use it as a tumbler. a little bit of a stupid example probably, but that's essentially what these three stages mean, right? But what do they mean in context of bringing about change in human beings? So when we are talking about unfreezing, we are talking about analyzing the system. What is the current state of the system? Really understanding it well. What are the conditions right now? Are they really suitable for change? If they are not, then our change attempt is going to fail. So we were talking about New Year's resolutions before. I gave the example of, say the example of exercising daily for 1 hour, or maybe 1 hour every 5 days per week. So that's the change that I want to bring about in myself. I know exercise is good for me and everything, so I from 1st of January I start this process. What's going to happen? If I had not been exercising before, if I was a literal couch potato previously, then what's going to happen is that after 2, 3, 4, maybe 5, 7 days of my exercising, I will injure myself, right? Because my body was not ready. It was not prepared to take the kind of load that I started giving myself suddenly from the 1st of January. So once I injure myself, what's going to happen? I will have to stop exercising. I'll have to go into the rest mode. I will have to quit exercising for maybe several weeks. So essentially, the change attempt fails. And once I take rest for several weeks, it's going to be again very difficult to go back into that exercise mode. Or we were talking about quitting alcohol. So I want to quit alcohol from 1st of January. But, the night before, let me just have that one last big party, last drink, and then I will quit alcohol. But what's going to happen next day? I'll have a hangover. My energy levels will be lower the next day. And, maybe even by the time I reach the evening of January 1st, I may be feeling bad that I did not start the day so well, and in that emotional state, I may feel even more tempted to drink alcohol, which I would, and so on and so forth, right? So the change attempt fails on the very first day. Let's say I'm a little bit more matured. I didn't indulge myself the night before on the New Year's Eve. But I may still fail if I have had that alcohol dependency, that physical dependency. Then I may suffer from what are called alcohol withdrawal symptoms, right? You know, and which then may force me to go back to drinking alcohol. So these change attempts failed because I did not create the suitable conditions necessary to initiate the change. So you cannot just start a change process immediately just because you decided that a change is needed, right? That's what I was mentioning before. So what Lewin says is that every system is in a quasi-stationary, stable state of equilibrium. Those are many words. But everything is already in a state of equilibrium. Anytime that you try to bring about any change, there is a resistance that's happening. Because similar to Newton's first law of motion, if you remember your physics lessons, what does it say? An object at rest will remain at rest. An object in motion will remain in motion and will continue to travel at the same speed and direction unless some external force applies on it. So there is a tendency not only of physical objects to continue to stay in that state in which they were before, but it's also a very psychological state that we all have, right? Psychological as well as physiological state. So we have a state in which we have made ourselves feel comfortable, in which we feel stable. So it's already in a state of equilibrium. So just trying to force change is going to be difficult because of this inertia that we all have. So, of course, he does not use the term inertia, Lewin. Lewin talks about, he calls this force field analysis. So you have to analyze all the different forces that are acting on the person or on the group. Some of those forces are forces that are resisting change. And your force of bringing about change will not work unless you remove those forces that are resisting change. Okay? So, going back to the examples of New Year's resolution, of exercising regularly or quitting alcohol or whatever, right? I will succeed in those change attempts if I create the right conditions for that change attempt to succeed. I need to prepare my body, right? Otherwise, I will fail. Let me give a very different example about which I think will be very helpful. Let's say there's an open field and I want to convert that into a playground, right? But there are rocks and it's dirty and there's a huge rock in the middle of it. So of course I cannot make it into a playground unless I move that rock out of the playground. So what should I do? I should probably have few people pull that rock, somebody pushing and few people pulling with different ropes, right? Will that help me move the rock? Maybe if it is a lighter rock and not too huge. But otherwise, it's going to be exceedingly difficult. Why? Because the rock is in a stable state. So if I want to remove that rock, if I want to change the status quo in which it is, I will have to maybe, dig underneath the rock, remove the gravel, the soil, and all that stuff that is preventing it from moving easily, right? Right? So that's what is being talked about here. So just pulling won't help. I have to destabilize the rock, and then change will be easier. So that's actually a term that is used by Lewin, destabilization, right? So if you want to make a change attempt successful, you will have to destabilize the stability of the system that exists before. How do you do that? In a group context, you may have to unsettle people. You may have to tell them, hey, you know what's going to happen if you're not going to change. Our company is going to whatever lose money, then we will have to other competitors will take over or whatever. I'm just making up these examples as I'm talking. So we may then lose jobs. So you create the scenarios in the mind. What if you don't change? So you are essentially trying to create some amount of motivation in people so that they feel the need to change. You create a felt need for change. And you not only say what are the different problems that will happen if people don't change. You also say about what will happen if they change, so that you create a buy-in, right? This is referred to as creating the kind of anxiety in people that if they don't change, then it's going to be problematic. But even before the induction of guilt or survival anxiety in people, what we need to do is we need to disconfirm the validity of the status quo. So what are the beliefs that people have currently? Okay, that's something that needs to be asked. I have probably been giving the same example of New Year's resolution many times now. So let me give a different example. Let's say I am trying to change the cell phone usage habits of people, of my students, okay, in class, or the usage of social media in class. But just to bring about that change, what I do is I create a policy that, hey, you guys are not supposed to check social media or whatever in class. Will that work? Well, it may work to a certain extent, but students will still find out a way to circumvent the rule and may continue to stay distracted during class, right? So I have to disconfirm the validity of the status quo. By that, I will have to make them believe that using cell phone or using social media is bad for them. You may actually believe, the students may actually believe that it's not bad, right? So that's the status quo. I have to make you believe that it is bad for you. So how do I do that? So I would have to provide information that contradicts your belief. So I may have to provide different statistics about what happens to learning, to performance on tests when students are distracted by social media versus when they are not distracted by social media. For example, okay? So that will probably convince you about the importance of not using social media. But then you could still come up with alternative arguments, right? You could come up with the alternative argument that's not relevant to me. I only spend, let's say we are talking about not just class situation, but overall life situation. I only spend 30 minutes per day, and that's nothing. So then I will have to provide evidence of the fact that no, you are not just spending 30 minutes, you are spending 5 hours. You thought you will be staying on social media for maybe a few minutes, but you end up staying much longer than you initially anticipate. So there are different apps through which one can monitor that, right? So I can provide you the data. You thought you were doing only 30 minutes, but here you are doing 3 hours. So you're wasting a whole lot of time. In the context of class, you may say, oh, I was just checking my Instagram for 5 seconds. That's a very short distraction period. I then immediately got my attention back to the lecture. Then I will have to provide you evidence of the fact that you are not just distracted by 5 seconds. You are actually distracted by 10 minutes. Yes, it is true that you were there on Instagram for maybe 5 seconds or maybe 10 seconds. But your distraction was for 10 minutes. How? Because even before you went and checked your social media, you had lost touch with the lecture because your mind is thinking, oh, what's happening? Has my friend responded to the post that I had done or whatever, right? Okay. So you had already lost touch with the lecture then. And then you check. And when you check, maybe the person has responded or person has not responded. And then your thoughts still stay with that activity for much longer period. Why hasn't my friend responded? Does she not love me anymore? Why have I, whatever. All those thoughts still stay in your mind for much longer than those 5-10 seconds. So there's a lot of research to this, so I'm not making up this example just. So you may end up being distracted for much, much more than those 10 seconds that you thought you were distracted. The actual time that you were distracted may be 5 minutes, 10 minutes. So I will have to provide you with these evidence that disconfirms the beliefs that you have about social media usage not harming you. So I will have to make sure that the information that I provide is valid, and I have to question the validity of the beliefs that you have. Right? And the information that I provide, I should make sure that you perceive it to be valid, and not just valid, but relevant to you, right? So only then will you be motivated to change. Otherwise, you will not. So when we are talking about unfreezing, we talk about disconfirming the validity of the status quo. Then we talk about induction of some kind of survival anxiety. So what's going to happen if you don't change? I will have to create those scenarios in your mind so that you feel motivated to change. In this context, the likelihood that you will fail or that you will not get the kind of jobs that you want to, or whatever those, or that those habits will persist to your workplace, which will then impair your performance there. Again, I don't necessarily want to go into all those details. But what's going to happen if you don't change? There's what's that movie's name? Clear and Present Danger. So the clear and present danger of you not changing, those are the kind of thoughts that I need to put in your mind so that you are motivated to change. But remember, I had told you something before. Motivation is not enough. Many of the examples that I gave you before, I did show you that you fail despite you being motivated to change. So along with creating this need for change, you have to provide what Lewin called psychological safety. You need to create those right conditions which will make it possible for you to change. So when talking about psychological safety, he talks about the kind of the feelings of trust and comfort that people need to have in the leader so that they want to change, so that they feel comfortable changing. That's of course true. So you have to have those open communication channels. You have to have mechanisms where they can voice their thoughts about the change process, about the decision making process without any fear. You need to make sure that they trust you. So you are a person who leads by example, who walks the walk, talks the talk, and not just talks the talk, right? So that you have their interest in mind and all that stuff. That you will provide the necessary support process so that they will be able to change. They will be able to bring about the change that you want them to. So all these things come into play there. One thing that Lewin didn't talk about, although you could argue that if you read between the lines, it does touch upon it, is the concept of self-efficacy. So creating this fear, the anxiety of all the negative things that's going to happen if you don't change, that's good. But along with it, you have to provide people with self-efficacy. If you remember my lectures on self-efficacy, it's a critical factor to succeeding in life, in whatever project that you have undertaken. In other words, you need to have the confidence that you will be able to change. If you do not have confidence that you can change, then you will not make the attempt to change. Or you will make half-hearted attempts to change, which will then lead you to fail. So creating that kind of supportive and inclusive environment where people feel they will get the necessary support when they are making the change attempt is really important. Because, as I said before, change is complex, it's difficult. It's not going to be a smooth process. Just because you decided that you will change something, change is not going to happen as easily. You will fail, right? Or the group will fail. It's not a straightforward process. So this brings us to the second point, which is the change process. Change, or sometimes it's also called moving. So you have created the motivation for people to change. But people may not change in the direction that you want them to, right? So going back to that rock example. So once you have removed all the debris underneath the rock, well, now the rock is not stable anymore. It is unstable. But then it may roll over in a direction that you did not want it to go, right? You may want the rock in a particular direction. So yes, you remove the forces that are preventing change from happening, but then you also have to initiate those forces that takes the change in the direction that you want it to happen. So just creating anxiety, let's say in children, that, hey, if you don't study, they will fail. That anxiety itself can then cause them to engage in other detrimental behaviors. They may not just start studying unless you have created self-confidence in them that they can study and they can succeed, for example, right? So you need to start the change in the direction that you want them to. Just creating the need for change or the anxiety for change is not enough. A really important point here is what Lewin called action research. So he says that you cannot plan for everything. Unfreezing has a lot of planning. So creating the right conditions and everything. But once you start the change process, there's a whole host of factors that come into play that you can never control for. So there is going to be what we can say a trial and error method that comes into play when you start the change process. So it's not like, a patient, say, has diabetes, okay, and goes to the physician. The physician creates the unfreezing by creating all the problems that this person is going to suffer from if he doesn't take control of his diabetes, right? That he may lose his vision, and his kidneys may get destroyed, and he will die sooner, and all that stuff. And so the physician may have taken all the necessary steps so-called necessary steps to make sure that the patient complies with the prescription that he makes, that of taking medicines regularly and taking care of his habits and so on and so forth, so that he stays healthy. And yet, that may not happen. In fact, there is some really great research pertaining to that as well. I'm forgetting the statistics right now, because this example just came into my mind, so I don't have the statistics right off my head. But the percentages are really high of people not following the prescription that they are supposed to follow. That's one of the primary reasons why treatments fail. In fact, they have found that people are much more likely to comply with these prescriptions when it comes to taking care of their dog as opposed to taking care of themselves. So creating the right conditions does not mean that things will happen in the right direction. So a lot of mistakes do happen even after you have initiated the change process. Failures happen. So this is something profound that Lewin said. He said that you cannot understand a system until you try to change it. So it's one thing to just talk about the importance of change, but it is completely another thing to actually implement the change. Once you implement it, you will realize there are many more obstacles that come into play. There are many more psychological obstacles, physical obstacles, societal obstacles that come into play. So you can never plan for everything in advance. So there's a lot of trial and error kind of thing that happens. So you learn as you go through the change process. So this is what action research is, right? So it's not everything is planned in advance. You learn as you move through the change process, as you implement the change process. You learn along the process, and you make modifications in your change as you move through the process. So that's the critical part about the change process. Many of you may have heard of Kaizen, the system that was pioneered by Toyota, right? The automobile company, car company, Toyota. So it's a process of continuous improvement, right? So everyone in the organization, even the smallest of the, smallest meaning in terms of hierarchy, of the employee, is given the authority to bring about changes which will increase the efficiency of the production process, right? So Kaizen, along with some of the other processes that Toyota manufacturing facilities has actually led to the kind of high reliable vehicles that they manufacture, which also led to, of course, they then getting the kind of huge market share that they have in the entire world. Now, everyone knows in the automobile industry, and not just in the automobile industry, in other industries as well, about Toyota's manufacturing process, about Kaizen, about 5S, about just in time, all these processes that made Toyota the kind of big success that it is today. But just knowledge is not enough, right? Why haven't the other companies, Ford, GM, or whatever, many other companies, been able to replicate the Toyota way of manufacturing, even though they have read about it, even though they have studied Kaizen, but they haven't been able to replicate it? Because it's one thing to just have the knowledge, and another thing to gain knowledge as you are moving through the change process. So you have to, you learn while doing. Not all of learning can happen only at a theoretical level, or only by observing people, or only going through the formal learning process. A lot of learning happens through this trial and error method, which happens when you are doing things. So one critical thing to remember is your change attempts will fail, and that's fine. That's how it is. But you make those small modifications and move forward. So it should not be going back to the New Year's resolution. It's not like one date after which you will be a different person. No, change has to be a continuous process. And as you are implementing change, you will see something is working, something is not working. You will have to make those necessary adjustments into your schedule and move forward. So anyway, I think the lecture has already become too long, much longer than actually I had initially anticipated. So let's go to the refreezing part. So when we are talking about refreezing, it's about creating a new normal. Okay. So yes, we have initiated the change, and change is starting to work in the kind of direction that we wanted it to. We are learning from the change process. But that does not mean that this change is going to last, because we need to make sure that the system is supportive of the new environment, new way of doing things that we have created. Okay, so unless there is support system for the new way of doing things, it's not going to last. It's going to falter after a while. Be it change happening at an individual level or at an organizational level or national level, doesn't matter. So it's almost like gardening, right? I want to have a garden with that grows vegetables. So unfreezing would be making sure that the garden is ready for me to sow the seeds, right? If I haven't prepared the conditions of the soil suitable for sowing the seeds, then my gardening is not going to work, right? So that would be unfreezing. But once I have planted the seeds, does not mean, and maybe the plants have started growing, doesn't mean that it's going to yield the crops, the yield that I wish to get, right? Because I still have to tend to my garden. I have to make sure that I remove the weeds. I have to make sure that there's a lot of tending and caring that has to go to make sure that these plants live and produce the kind of yield that I want from them. Without that, these plants are probably going to be eaten away by other animals, or maybe they will wilt and die and all that stuff, right? So same kind of analogy. So I will have to make sure that I am watering them, I am giving them the necessary nourishment through, and making sure that it continues to flourish. Same thing applies to relationships too, right? Just because we decide to bring about a change in relationship doesn't mean that that change is going to last. We have to make sure that we continue to support and appreciate the other person. That's when relationships work. Often one of the common reasons why relationships fail after a while, I'm talking about marital relationships here, or any kind of romantic relationships, is because people stop doing those things that they used to do before, that of appreciating, that of taking care of each other. So just because a change has happened, just because you are married now, doesn't mean that it's going to last unless you take the necessary steps of creating that new normal, creating that environment where those changes will persist, right? So, going back to the example of exercising daily, I will have to make sure, or eating healthy foods, or sleeping well, I will have to make sure that others in my family, or they are supportive of this change initiative that I started. Otherwise, it's going to falter, right? Because remember, those forces, they continue to work. So if I am not taking care of those forces, then it's not going to be sustainable. There is some, again, tremendous statistics about how most of the leadership development programs fail. I have this information in some of my lectures that I do on the topic of leadership. Vast majority of them fail. And one of the reasons why they fail is because leaders go to these leadership development programs that happens at some resort or something. They learn new things. But when they come back to the organization, to their actual workplace, it's the actual workplace is not necessarily conducive to continue with that change, to continue with that change model that they brought, right? So they will not be able to sustain that change. That's the reason these change attempts fail. So from a leadership perspective, you have to make sure that all these company policies, the procedures, the systems, the reward system, the recognition system, the benefits, everything is supportive of the change that you have initiated. Only then it is likely to be sustainable. Otherwise, it's going to fail. So this is essentially what the Lewin's change model is. I gave you a lot more detail than probably I was initially anticipating to, but I hope this lecture provided you sufficient amount of insight that you will be able to inculcate in your own change attempts. One important thing, in the context of refreezing is also the failures that happen when you make any change attempts. Like slip-ups are inevitable. So if you don't anticipate that, then you will revert back to your old ways. Like in drinking, right? Yes, you succeeded in staying away from alcohol for maybe a month, but then one small slip-up can happen. And then what happens? People then revert to their old ways. Oh, I've already broken my resolution. Let me go back to my old ways. So refreezing means also having the kind of support system that can deal with such slip-ups, that can deal with such failures, and how to continue to be supportive of the new way of living. Just because one slip-up happened doesn't mean that you have to give up entirely on the change attempt, right? So all these factors come into play when we are trying to bring about any change. So the later models, that we will discuss in context of organizational change, you will realize essentially built up on Lewin's model. So it's a really profound model that has made, of course, great contribution to the field, and the fact that people still talk about Lewin's model is a testament to the wisdom that lies in this model. It seems simplistic, but it is not, especially if you dive deeper into the model. That's the reason I decided that I will do a longer lecture on the topic so that you understand the real insights that lie in this model. So with that, we'll stop the lecture here. Thank you.